what we do, and particularly those of us who write for the general public, has importance in terms of providing a narrative basis, a story within which people can locate themselves, within which they can find the meaning and direction in their lives.
Well, we are exceptionally fortunate today to have another great speaker, Professor Wilfred McClay, who is an old friend to NAS. Professor McClay doesn't really need to be introduced at Pepperdine because right now he's a visiting professor here, the Ronald Reagan Professor of Public Policy at the School of Public Policy in which we are present. But this isn't the only place he hangs out. For some reason or another, he was willing to let go of his usual residence at the University of Oklahoma for these hard digs up here. At Oklahoma, he is the G.T. and Libby Blankenship Chair of History of Liberty, which seems like a good fit for our topic. Now, I've just got word that the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, which gives an annual award for the best conservative book of the year, has chosen Bill McClay's Land of Hope as its award winner for this coming year. So congratulations on that. He's a prolific writer. I'm not going to give a list of all those publications, but some of the ones that matter are Why Place Matters, which deals with geography, identity, and civic life in modern America, and a book that I think made his career, The Masterless Self and Society in Modern America. Bill and I worked together when we were opposing the College Board's Advanced Placement U.S. History revised standards, and the Land of Hope, his textbook on American history, which defies the advice given to Joel Lepore in spades, came out of that pushback against APUSH. We succeeded to a degree. That is, the College Board, faced with the ire of historians and others, decided that it would restore to American history some key figures that might otherwise have just languished somewhere in the shade, like George Washington, for example, who was actually in the APUSH standards for one thing, which was his farewell speech. What he was saying farewell to was left unsaid. The role that Wilfred McClay plays in American history right now, I think, is a very significant one. He is the voice of the center right. I guess I dare to put him into that much of a political context. He's standing up for a coherent vision of American history that should and could be taught, and now he's demonstrated how to teach it in our public schools. And with that, I think he provides a very useful counterpoint to what Stanley has been talking about. That is, he is willing to be reassured and willing to reassure the rest of us that American history can be taught in a coherent way. And with that, I welcome you.
Thank you, Peter. And it is bright. Wow. I feel like I'm in Hollywood. It is wonderful to be here, and it's true, Pepperdine feels like a second home to me, and there's a lot of familiar faces and familiar people. I want to say a couple of things prefatory. First of all, about NAS. I know a number of you are NAS members and would be here anyway in all probability, but I do want to say that Peter Wood and NAS generally, even going back to the Steve Balch era, Steve being the founder of the organization, has been a great encouragement to me. It's one of the reasons why I'm, willing to try to do the things I do, is because we are a band of brothers and sisters that are working for something we really believe in, something very good. So I'm just grateful for the existence of NAS, and Peter's presidency has revitalized it in a way that has been remarkable. All the reports that he mentioned earlier, these are all a product of his presidency, I believe. But don't correct me if I'm wrong. But also, we had such a great panel. I was a bit concerned about giving a keynote speech at the end of a conference. That's something I've never done before, and I always think of the keynote coming at the beginning, setting the key, the note that sets the key. But the oboe, so to speak, to which the orchestra tunes. And now I'm not sure where I fit in the concert, maybe playing an encore in the Flight of the Bumblebee. But what I decided to do was to try, in part, to respond to the panel, but also to try to sort of lift the discussion up to a different realm, maybe a more speculative realm. And in that sense, I'm not the encore, I'm the dessert. Tiramisu, which in Italian means lift me up. And finally, I want to pay tribute and honor to my very, very distinguished senior colleague in the historical profession, Daniel Walker Howe, who has written many other books. In fact, the Unitarian book is one I've never read, but I've read his other books, and the one that I want to mention that I think is a near perfect book is called The Political Culture of the American Whigs. And it's absolutely, if you think of the second quarter of the 19th century as the age of Jackson, you must read this book. It will disabuse you of that idea. And of course, someone has mentioned his Oxford History of the United States work, What Hath God Wrought, which won every prize in sight when it was published. Without further ado, my task of lifting you up begins on a somewhat sour note, because I want to begin with a quotation, some familiar quotation, that I think may capture some of the angst, dilemma that we face in thinking about Western civilization and about the defense of it. It's from Walter Benjamin, or as Americans say, Walter Benjamin. I like to think of him as Walt myself, but the German critical theorist, Frankfurt School, or proto-Frankfurt School fellow. It's from his short but very poetic and hard to interpret Theses on the Philosophy of History. And the quote is this: "There is no document of civilization which is not at the same time a document of barbarism." Let me repeat. There is no document of civilization which is not at the same time a document of barbarism. Let me unpack it a little bit. The theses, the work from which, it's very short, very short work, and sort of Nietzschean in its tone, its aphoristic style. And it was meant, really, it represented his renunciation of historical materialism, which is to say Marxist historicism, and in a sense, the entire progressive, small p, but you could make it large P also, progressive understanding of history, that history is a story of unfolding progress. A kind of Whig understanding of history, if you will, also, except that liberty is not the aim of it. It's also among his last words, because he committed suicide in 1940, and there's a story behind that, but partly out of a sense of despair that the rise of fascism, the rise of Nazism, and the Hitler's conquest of Europe completely refuted his favorite historical theories. In a larger sense, though, I think one reason it's worth thinking about, it's worth quoting, is that it expresses something about the burden of the past, the fact that no great historical accomplishment comes about without some price being paid for it, some impurity involved in the process by which it enters the world. And in fact, there are no such events, aside perhaps from the virgin birth of Jesus, that entered the world without that price, without that impurity. Every glorious thing, I think he's saying, has some trace in its background of something suppressed, of, as Yates said, of body bruised to pleasure soul, of a process by which the means of production, if I may echo Marx for a minute, not be thrown out of the room, that involves systems of oppression that gradually, in our story, in the more Whiggish account, lead to a greater and greater recognition of the dignity of the individual and of individual liberty. Not so much for Benjamin. Anyway, I think there's wisdom in this insight. Every document of civilization is also a document of barbarism, but only if it's received in an intelligent, wise, mature way. It also can be extremely sophomoric sounding. I could imagine, Holden Caulfield, the hero of Catcher in the Rye, sort of trotting it out as a way of being a smart aleck with his bubbly history teacher in his high school class, and it could be used in a broad brush way, to sort of say that every single achievement of the civilization of the West is as blood-soaked as the treasure extracted by mafia chieftains, except, of course, for the work of academic historians, which is pure. One of the things I hear, both in Stanley's account and in some of the responses to him, is there really are sort of two conflicting but coexisting ways of thinking about the West among its opponents. One is that the West doesn't really exist. The West, what we call the West, is an illusion, a fabricated or invented form of community that really ultimately is of interest and has viability only insofar as it serves power interests, powerful interests. Or the West is a pernicious, cancerous, imperial force, unsettling settled lives across the globe, imposing its imperial logic of reductive capitalism and rational science on the spontaneity and joy of indigenous and organic life in the rest of the world. So it's illusion or it's a horrible cancer. Take your pick. It reminds me, and I think Susan Hansen got at the fact that in some ways these two different views are used strategically depending on the need of the occasion. I thought a poem, I always like poems, as my students know, might capture this. It's a poem called Antigonish, which you may not know by the title, but you may know the lines I'm going to quote from it. Yesterday, upon the stair, I met a man who wasn't there. He wasn't there again today. Oh, how I wish he'd go away. There you have it. Yeah, Western civilization is an illusion. It's not there. I wish it would go away. So the denial of the reality of the West, whatever term we use to describe it, and I'm perfectly happy with the term European civilization myself, but the denial of the reality of the West is a strategy for deconstructing the West, as I think Stanley Kurtz has shown in his account, in order to counter and ultimately dissolve its pernicious influence. The undercurrent of animus in these analyses is a sure sign that the man on the stair is really there. But part of the problem is the complexity of just what the West is, what we mean by that term. It's very hard to articulate with any kind of definiteness or precision. Because it involves a complicated history of cumulative influences, a lot of cultural appropriation going on, a lot of cultural appropriation. We in the West, we are an ambitious civilization in every sense of that term, ambitious civilization, which is committed both to a robust and venerable religious tradition and to an intellectual tradition of unsparing self-criticism and skeptical doubt. We would not be ourselves without either one. We need both. What we call the West is built on conflicting strands of thought and moral tradition, best compressed for me, maybe not for everyone, but for me, in the opposition of Athens and Jerusalem, a symbolic opposition. But it includes multifarious traditions of law, custom, economic activity, etc. I think part of what we suffer from in the West, one reason for the popularity, if we can call it that, of the Allardyce thesis and the general sort of skepticism about it, is that we have a sense of guilt, of civilizational guilt. It's a guilt over our failures. It's also a guilt over our achievements. All the documents of civilization have been underwritten by acts of barbarism, genocide, Indian removal, slavery, etc. We see this, of course, in our historical writing, not only about America, it's certainly just as true of European historical writing, which is heavily preoccupied with imperialism and with the post-imperial conditions of the world, and I think not unrightly so. But there's a question of proportion. And our historiography, and I know I've been inside the belly of the beast for a while, is overwhelmingly critical in character, not universally so, and thank goodness for that. I think Dan Howe is right about that. There are points of light here and there, but one of the things that I'm going to sort of relate, this is very anecdotal, but I have an experience as a teacher for these years that I think is relevant. I call it the new default. And it goes something like this. When I first started teaching, I actually taught on the high school level for a little while, and then college. You'd always run into this phenomenon, and those of you who teach will know exactly what I'm talking about. You sign an essay exam, and which is what I pretty much do all the time. And you ask a question that the students simply can't answer. They don't know. They haven't done the reading. They haven't come to class. They just don't know. Why did Andrew Jackson have opposed the Bank of the United States so vociferously? Well, and stubbornly, and maniacally, you might even say. Well, they don't know the answer, so they kind of stumble around that Andrew Jackson was a fierce man. He was maniacal at times. And just sort of repeating the question in various forms. And then it will move into what I call the Stars and Stripes Forever phase, where they say, but it's all because America's the greatest country in the world, and that's why he felt we didn't need a national bank because we were already the greatest country, whatever. That's the first default when I started teaching in the 80s. Now, I probably don't even need to tell you that now the default is more like, well, this is a nation with grievous faults. This is a nation characterized by genocide. It was founded in 1619 in the way that we've been hearing about lately. That's what explains it all. This student probably doesn't know anything more about the Bank of the United States or Andrew Jackson than the one 30 years ago did. But I call it the new default. And in either case, this is what the student who's desperately trying to avoid getting an F thinks will curry favor with me. That this is what I want to hear. I want to hear America's the greatest nation on earth 30 years ago or so. And now I want to hear America is the most sinful nation on earth, the most in need of rebuke and critical appraisal. So I think there's something like this mentality of the new default that it has taken over, and I think it's reflected in and is a concomitant or maybe even a product of the tone of so much historical writing over the last 30-some years. We emphasize the historiography of marginalized groups, which I think is a worthy, extremely important endeavor. But to do it to the extent that the main story itself is marginalized, and people know nothing about the subject other than what's on the margins, that's not a good situation. I think that's in many ways where we are. Something else just on this subject of guilt and civilizational guilt. I am a college professor, and I'm attuned as much as I can handle it to the sensitivities of my students, some of whom, and I would even say the best of whom in certain ways, are almost absurdly concerned about the ways that not only is their lifestyle privileged, but their very existence impinges on the integrity and sustainability of, the noun that's coming, the planet. The planet. Not just the earth, it has to be the planet. And I don't want to make fun of this. I am making fun of it. I shouldn't do that. Because I have considerable empathy for the moral seriousness of these students. They may be ill-informed, but they're morally serious. And they're young people. So that's part of what you want to do. You don't want to stifle them. You don't want to ridicule them. You want to help them along, ask probing questions that will make them think. But I was struck recently by an article in The Atlantic by a Columbia law school professor who labored mightily and not particularly convincingly to make a case for the justification of his wife's, his decision to have a child, adding that this was a concession he was not willing to make to climate change of foregoing children, but that he and his wife were determined to bring up the child, acutely conscious of the way that his very existence was burdening the planet and placing its wonders under perilous strain. In other words, the child will be brought up to feel guilty, existentially guilty. Reading this, I didn't know whether to laugh or cry, whether to take this very earnest author seriously or dismiss his intelligent but highly self-indulgent essay as an exercise in what we now call virtue signaling. Those who take the latter view, the virtue signaling view, have to concede that his view of the subject is consistent with a general perspective that can call upon battalions of respectable scientific support. And yet, it has to be conceded that there's something about the subject of climate change that brings out an apocalyptic strain in our psyches, our rhetoric, or at least many of us. How to distinguish one from the other, how to know for sure that a sensible position is not a complacent one, or a woke position is not a hysterical one. Now, I'm not bringing this up to explore the question of whether we're right or wrong to feel guilty about climate change. I'm interested in the ways in which our growing sense of our power in the world, our power over the world, and our concomitant sense of responsibility, both of these a product of Western science and the triumph of Western science, make it very difficult to arrive at, easily at any way, at sensible conclusions about how we're to live our lives. This is one of the things I think is exaggerated but made clear by the reaction of these students that I mentioned. Our adoption of the inexact but evocative term Anthropocene to describe our epoch in this post-natural era is a double sword. If we're increasingly in charge of everything, as our science and technology has been making us, then we're increasingly responsible for everything and increasingly guilty for everything that's not quite as it should be. And it's very easy for our views on the subject to be influenced by and even contaminated by other factors, a disgust with the flaws of our civilization, its materialism, its consumerism, its decadence. This can have a powerful moral effect on us, but it can also mislead us. To use an imprecise but I think very useful analogy, there's a widespread sense that the allegedly riotous and materialistic culture of the so-called Roaring '20s led to the deprivations of the Great Depression. The story has a moral plausibility about it, like an Aesop fable, but it's demonstrably untrue, and no respectable historian today would contend that too many parties and too much bathtub gin caused the Great Depression. The point, though, is that there's a powerful emotional tendency to draw automatically the connection between excess and calamity, like the connection between intoxication and hangover. Those of you who know Malcolm Cowley's book, Exile's Return, it ends exactly that way, the end of the 20s, as being waking up with a hangover. Such a connection may be driving the way in which we feel guilty for and anxious about our prosperity and profligacy. It may even be true, but just because the heart has its reasons, as Pascal said, it may not be true. But let me offer some suggestive statistics. This is not much tiramisu either here. Suicides among Americans aged 10 to 24 increased by more than 50% between 2007 and 2017. The suicide rate for all ages rose by 30% between 1999 and 2016. Life expectancy in the United States is falling, a downward slide driven by declines in life expectancy, particularly among working class whites. And I'm thinking here of the research of Angus Deaton and Ann Case, their famous study, drug overdose, suicide, liver disease caused by alcoholism leading the way of causes. February 2019 Pew report indicates 70% of teens think anxiety and depression are major problems for their peers. Around 50% identify alcohol and drug addiction as major problems. Worries about mental illness and self-destructive behavior among the young run through all sectors of society, not just the college-educated and not just the poor. Although I'm struck, again, in those 30 years at how many, many more mental health problems we encounter and have to deal with as professors compared to when I began teaching. I'm concerned about these kinds of statistics, as any sensible person should be. To me, they betoken a kind of incipient moral collapse. And a collapse I don't think can be traced, and here I'm with Benjamin, I don't think can be traced to material causes alone. I think it has in part to do with a loss of meaning in people's lives. And loss of meaning is at least in part because they no longer feel themselves to be connected to and part of a larger story, a larger narrative that gives meaning and directionality, purposefulness, and just sense to their lives. Again, a point that Susan Hansen made very nicely. The Allardyce article comes very roughly around the time of the end of the Cold War. And that's a very convenient time to start thinking about ways in which narratives that have held in place for decades suddenly are obsolete and out the window. And there's this new search for a meaningful narrative about what the United States is, what it's doing, where it fits into the world picture, what being the world's leader means in a post-Cold War environment. And some of us are old enough to remember the debates that went on in that time. A lot of it occasioned by a sense, believe it or not, there was a sense at the time that the whole Marxian idea was exhausted, that Marxist ideas had just petered out. Capitalism, liberal capitalism was it. But not a lot of clarity about what would come next. Francis Fukuyama's The End of History essay was a sensation for a while, taking the view that the alternatives to liberal democracy, liberal capitalism, democratic capitalism, had all been proven inadequate, and this was the only regime on offer, that human history came to an end in that sense, that if the history is thought of as a sort of sorting out and a dialectical process of testing regimes, that was over. That was what the meaning of his title was, a very unfortunate title. One thing about Fukuyama I just want to mention in passing is that this was not entirely a happy thing in his view. I'm happy to pile on Fukuyama for a lot of blunders, but he never says that it would be a utopia. He said, in fact, that the end of history would be a sad time because there would be nothing left to aspire to, that people would come to resemble Nietzsche's Last Man. So just in his defense. Anyway, not necessarily in opposition to him, but effectively in opposition, arose Samuel Huntington of Harvard, whose notion of the clash of civilizations that would succeed the ideological conflicts that had been characteristic, at least of the Cold War era and much of the 20th century, would come to the fore. Interestingly, one difference for our purposes between the two is that the Fukuyama vision really is of a kind of, with the Western vision of things becoming universalized. And Huntington's is very definitely not that the West was always going to be different, and that the civilizational boundaries were quite strong and durable. And so Americans should not think of themselves as involved in a kind of missionary operation, the Redeemer Nation to the rest of the world. They should focus on their own situation. Well, and there was a lot of debate between and among those different schools of thought. The best formulation for my mind came from a Swarthmore political scientist named James Kurtz. And Kurtz wrote an article in the National Interest magazine in which he predicted, and I'll quote him, "The real clash of civilizations will not be between the West and one or more of the rest. It will be between the West and the post-West, within the West itself." That's a very interesting formulation. We see this clash played out today between the EU elites attempting to expand their supranational bureaucratic authority and independent nation states within the EU, such as Britain, for the moment, Italy, Hungary, Poland, has been mentioned, who are fighting to preserve their sovereignty, their independence as a nation state, their ability to be distinct constitutional regimes. In other words, they were insisting on the right of a free people to rule themselves. This desire for independence and sovereignty, national sovereignty, was the impetus for Brexit, for the British people's decision to withdraw from the European Union, which looks as if it may actually happen after years and years. For years, the U.S. position on all of this has been really rather automatically advocating more European integration, meaning more power for the Brussels bureaucracy, less the nation states. As has already been pointed out, that shifted after 2016. But rather than focus on that, although the Warsaw speech is really an excellent text to look at, I want to quote a man named Todd Huizinga from the Foreign Service, who wrote a very good book called The New Totalitarian Temptation about the EU. And he calls it a soft utopia, a proposed secular heaven on earth based on the ideology of global governance. And this guy is not a crackpot. He's a 20-year veteran of the U.S. Foreign Service. After 65 years, Huizinga writes, the EU has convincingly shown itself to be inherently undemocratic, unaccountable, and unresponsive to the voters. Obviously, he's including years before the formal creation of the EU. But simply, the EU is post-democratic. Does that mean it is Western? Or is it post-Western in Kurtz's sense? You know, in a way, we have a two Europes problem. What do we mean by Europe, by the West? Is Europe this ambitious but fraught project of welding the continent together into a fluid and borderless, unified economic, political, and cultural union, held together by an abstract, supranational, invented identity, a currency adorned with secular symbols, the tentacles of a vast administrative bureaucracy headquartered in Brussels, a disinterested substitute for obsolete historical conventions and customs. That is one vision of Europe. Or does Europe refer more vividly but more vaguely, I think, to a certain rich and complex way of life, along with the values and institutions that have made that way of life possible? Let me list a few. Free and self-governing institutions, constitutionally limited governments, prosperity-generating economies, equality before the law, protection of fundamental human rights, freedom of expression, rational inquiry, imagination, respect for the dignity of the individual person, high regard for criticism and self-criticism and debate, and a glorious and cosmopolitan heritage of ideas, stories, artifacts, science, language, and I do want to mention historical consciousness, something that Peter emphasized as a distinctive part of the European endowment. Historical consciousness. All of these things laid out by like a magnificent feast on a single vast table stretching from antiquity to yesterday or tomorrow. That is just another way of thinking about Europe, that multifarious, complicated, messy, and yet cosmopolitan, not necessarily dominated by the fierce solipsism of the individual nation states, run out of a desire to preserve the sort of blood in the soil. So these two meanings of Europe are and therefore the West, are related, but they're not the same. And it's a grave error to conflate them. In fact, the newer understanding of Europe is going to come about, to the extent it is coming about, at the expense of the second. For whatever else we may mean by the term Western civilization, we generally mean a civilization that balances diverse and opposite tendencies. And in particular, I want to emphasize in these last moments of my talk, the imperatives of biblical piety and the imperatives of rational inquiry. That classic formulation that I alluded to before, the balance or tension between Athens and Jerusalem, symbolically. This is a formulation, of course, as you know, goes back to the church father Tertullian, who used it to express an irreconcilable opposition between Greek philosophy, for which he had absolutely no use, and biblical faith. What has Athens to Jerusalem? He bellowed on the page. quite rhetorically. It wasn't a question he needed to have answered. But history has a way of making even irreconcilables lie down together. And as the political philosopher Leo Strauss argued, in fact, it is the tension between Athens and Jerusalem that's made Western civilization what it is. Let me flesh out these abstractions a little bit. Athens, as Strauss and others understand the term, but I'm really kind of going by Strauss's formulation here. Athens stands for the spirit of free, rational inquiry undertaken in a fully intelligible world whose contours and dimensions are fully commensurable with our powers of understanding. So Athens really includes the sort of classic continental and also British Enlightenment, Scottish as well. Jerusalem, on the other hand, the abstraction of Jerusalem stands for the spirit of piety, which insists on the weakness of human understanding, not the capaciousness of human understanding, but the weakness of human understanding, the inadequacy of unaided human intellect and unaided human nature. Insists that we are utterly reliant for guidance on the very few ways in which God has revealed himself to us and his will to us, and that such reliance constitutes a wisdom superior to any ratiocination, that's a word I have trouble with, because God's ways are not our ways. It is by faith, in this view, by faith and a faithful way of life that we're saved, and not by our knowledge. There's nothing that takes precedence in this view over the fear of the Lord. Well, Strauss, who felt himself very much pulled between these things as an observant Jew, but also as a Western philosopher, student of Heidegger, and so on. This antagonism between what he called the two conflicting roots of Western civilization. It's the core, the nerve of Western intellectual history and the secret of the West's vitality. A life lived, as he said, between two codes in fundamental and unresolved tension. And yes, the combination is arguably incoherent. And yet, we would no longer be ourselves should we become all one or all the other. A variant version of this antagonism was offered by Matthew Arnold in one of the essays collected in his 1869 book, Culture and Anarchy. 1869, that was before the First World War, by the way. I just want to point out. Of course, he was not an American. So, Arnold proposed in this essay a contrast between what he called Hellenism and Hebraism. He considered the two to be spiritual disciplines, each aiming at man's perfection and salvation. Arnold said, the uppermost idea with Hellenism is to see things as they really are. The uppermost idea with Hebraism is conduct and obedience. These divergent conceptions were in turn rooted in divergent perceptions, divergent experiences. And quoting Arnold again, as Hellenism speaks of thinking clearly, seeing things in their essence and beauty as a grand and precious feat for man to achieve, so Hebraism speaks of becoming conscious of sin, of waking to a sense of sin as a feat of this kind. Hellenism celebrates man's capacity for perfection and glory in and through the exercise of his own power. Hebraism reminds him of his limits, of his capacity for ignominy and shamefulness in and through the same exercise. Neither impulse could ever drive the other away entirely. Each enjoyed its own season of dominance, its season of recession. Both had roles to play in an unfolding economy of mind and spirit, like the different parts of a reciprocating engine. Admittedly, both formulations fail to capture the full dimensions of Hebraism, its ebullience, its creative energy, its reverence for the law, its electric sense, which I think you get very strongly from Jonathan Edwards, who you talk about, its electric sense of living in a world that's suffused with moral significance. But the opposition of the two is part of a larger unity or disunity, if you will, is central to the way we've so far conceived of the West. And here, just to mix things up a little bit, I want to read a public speech by an American politician of, well, I won't say which century. And I want to see if anybody, Dan Howe will know what this is because he knows everything, but the rest of you may not. Let me read it. Almighty God, our sons, I'll tell you, it was over the radio. That'll help you. So it wasn't John Quincy Adams. Or Lincoln even. Almighty God, our sons, pride of our nation, this day have set upon a mighty endeavor, a struggle to preserve our republic, our religion, our civilization, and to set free suffering humanity. And we know that by thy grace and the righteousness of our cause, our sons will triumph. Anyone know who? FDR. Yeah, well, okay. Yes, it's FDR's D-Day speech on June the 6th of 1944 in the evening radio broadcast as the invasion was well underway. Can you imagine a politician doing that today and being that willing to acknowledge, as I would put it, the Jerusalem Hebraic, fundamentally religious Christian orientation, and there are other FDR quotes that one could adduce. They're similarly religion infused. This doesn't mean anything about Roosevelt's own religiosity. This is about public legitimacy, the legitimacy of using that language in public. I think one thing that's clear is that the balance between Athens and Jerusalem, or between Hellenism or Hebraism, in what we think of as the West, has been altered, very much to the disadvantage of Jerusalem, speaking generically, and is in danger of being destroyed altogether. The progress of our scientific and technological knowledge in the West, of the culture of mastery over nature that's come along with it, has displaced the cultural centrality of Christianity and Judaism, but has not been able to replace them and offer itself as a substitute moral preceptor for us. We need that Jerusalem element in the tension that makes up our civilization to affirm in an unqualified way the dignity of the human person as a fundamental principle. Things like the elective concept of gender, in which the formerly fixed things of nature are no longer fixed, but must be made submissive to the individual will, and which cannot be brooked or confined. That's an example of it. I think the greatest challenge ethically that I see is the challenge of transhumanism. Although there are certainly others that one could mention coming out of biological engineering, out of the engineering of human life. There are not principles, I think, arising out of the Athenian side of the equation that tell us how to live, tell us how to move forward beyond those things. So I think one of the ways that we need to restore our civilization, we need to restore that element, that balance in our perception of ourselves, which means a willingness to remember how important the religious sensibility has been in the past of America, and make sure that we own that as part of what we are. I'm so grateful to Peter for stressing this. It's the importance of historical consciousness as a distinctive asset of the West. It is one of the ways, it's one of the chief ways that we understand our membership in any social entity, but particularly in a nation state. And this is why the recovery of the American story, which is one of the reasons I wrote this book that I wrote, is so crucial, so important. It's a task that, as Dan Howe has, I think, implied, historians have neglected, professional historians. We don't see that as our job. And maybe in some sense it isn't. Maybe we are fundamentally about the disinterested investigation of things and letting the chips fall where they may. But in fact, what we do, and particularly those of us who write for the general public, has importance in terms of providing a narrative basis, a story within which people can locate themselves, within which they can find the meaning and direction in their lives. Not every bit of their lives. People have lots of narratives and on lots of levels. But I would contend that dissociation from the regime of which one is a part, and even the contempt for a regime, is a recipe for disaster. And that is the road I think we've been on for some time. We need to get off of it. Thank you. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, one or two questions. I've been instructed.
Yeah, just a couple questions.
Well, I'll read something to you if you like. I brought this book, The Triumph of the West, which, despite its triumphalist title, has to have all sorts of misgivings. But he does end. I love the way this ends, and I just want to read this to you. What the West has done to the rest of the world, it has done indelibly. Nothing can be the same again. History has been changed by the West, which has made the world one world. The sheer energy and dynamism it showed in doing this have never been equaled. That's an incontrovertibly true statement. All of those statements are incontrovertibly true. Let me conclude. Western civilization has been humanity's greatest champion. It is the greatest claim ever made for men's unique status among living creatures as a change-making animal. This is why, however, we choose to draw our balance sheets about the value of the civilization. Its vigor is still so evident. I think that's true, even now, even in our demoralized times. When the first men on the moon stepped out to look about them at the planet Earth they had left not long before, they not only showed, simply by being there, the astonishing capacity of their civilization to manipulate nature, but also the colossal promise it can still hold out. There is no unquestionable ground for thinking that mankind is in a dead end, or that the creativity it has derived from Western civilization has been eclipsed. Isn't that a hopeful way to end our time? Cheers.